So what I usually do at the beginning of this unit is I talk about what infants like perceptual ability is when they're born, because a lot of people don't think of babies as having sensory ability, but they do. It's just a lot more undeveloped. It's going to take time to develop. And so if you were to compare it to adult ability, it's not nearly the same. So for example, when you look at adults' normal 20/20 vision, babies are estimated to have about 10 to 30 times lower ability than that. And over the first year, it starts to develop to roughly approximate adult vision. Usually, I would say between 6 and 9 months, you're starting to see by their actions that they can see a lot better than they did initially. Because when babies first are born, they're basically scanning, looking for outlines, looking for shadows that are perceived as something. When you see the research that's put in the human growth or the child development textbooks, the visual preference comes from these studies that we're going to talk about today. And those preferences that they mention are the fact that they like busy patterns as opposed to color or brightness, because it's, again, they're scanning, looking for those distinguishing dark to light. So that is why they prefer that. And they also, if anything, prefer faces most of all. And a lot of theorists, like learning theorists or behavioral theorists, would say it's the association with the parent with food. But that is exactly what Vance was trying to prove, is that there's actually some innate basis that it's unlearned. So this is an example of what a baby would see over the first year, kind of what their visual ability looks like. Okay, so you can see from birth to 1 year, it's a constant development. Another study that we don't necessarily talk about in this text, I think they actually did add it to the new text that I didn't want to adopt because it just costs more, is this visual cliff experiment. This is another study that they did to talk about like how well babies actually perceive things. They worked with babies, I believe, from like 8 to 14 months, just at the age where they would start to crawl. And as you can see there, he is on a checkerboard pattern. There's a plexiglass piece that goes across the whole table, but there is a shallow side and a deep side. And as you can see, he is perched on the shallow side and is not really willing to go over to the deep side. However, they had mom sit on the other side and attempt to coax the babies across. And sometimes they would, sometimes they wouldn't. Most of the time they remained on the shallow side. And that from that, they, kind of concluded that they had some perceptual ability with text at that age too. Okay, so let's talk about this study. So the first thing that I want to remind you of is back, like from Psych 101, they talk about sensation and perception. Sensation is something that is very passive, okay? It is your body's sensory organs taking in stimuli from the environment. You don't have to work at it. You don't have to think about it. It just is what your body does, as long as you have the ability. So for example, if someone was blind, obviously they don't have that ability. And so this would be an example of that would be the sound of a tone, the smell of a food. But it's not, I smell this, so I think it is this. That would be the organization part, which is perception. So if you, like, for example, pizza smells very, like you can smell oregano and tomato sauce and cheese, and maybe if there's veggie toppings or meat toppings, you put that together and it's a familiar smell. That's the perception piece, where you're organizing the stimuli, the smells, into something that's meaningful, okay? I know, for example, my kids, I use a lot of garlic at my house. It's just one of my like go-to spices, and they will sometimes mess up what I'm making because of the fact that they're having that perception that it goes with something else. So know the difference between sensation and perception. So when the study began, a little background information, you know, the behaviorists were the ones who were kind of ruling the psychology world. What does that mean? They were the ones who were all about, as I was saying, the learning. So reinforcement, punishment, all of those things helped us learn behaviors. And so that is why I mentioned when we were talking, or I was talking about the preference of the face, they would say that the infant prefers the face because it's been paired over and over again with something that's reinforcing. Okay. However, that theme that we mentioned at the beginning, the themes of child psychology, the theme of rebellion is here, which basically means that Fanch said, I don't believe that. I think that there's some pre-wiring. I think there's some biological basis to this whole ability to perceive and see. So that is what he set out to study. Okay. So this idea of potential issues with the studies, he's working with very young babies, and it's really difficult to, you know, kind of guess what they're actually saying or preferring, right? So he had to come up with some sort of methodology that allowed the babies to communicate. And these two links here, the Baby Lab is a video that you guys will do a reaction paper on next week, and it's really interesting. And then this is a clip of just a very, very newly born baby, and it shows him kind of the scanning and how alert he is, even from, you know, very, very young age. This is a quote from the reading, and if anything, I would argue that it's not true. If we were having a what do you call it? If we were having a class discussion, I would be having you guys present arguments for each side. You know, what would you say is evidence that babies are not thinking or that they are thinking, that sort of thing? And are they just reflex machines? So let's talk about his studies. He had 4 studies. He started with newly born chicks. Obviously, people probably were not readily, this is true with any study with infants, readily wanting to let their babies go or to have them raised in darkness, because that's what he did with these chicks. He had them hatched in darkness, and he had them in darkness until he needed them for the study, and that was to prevent any learning from occurring, because again, he's trying to prove that they are not learning to have these preferences, that instead there's some inborn preference. So what he did with these chicks is he presented them objects, I think they were on cards actually, and they ranged from triangles to spheres. So sphere is a circle, and I don't know if you guys are familiar with chickens at all, but chick food is circular. And so he found how many times, or he measured how many times they would peck on these different objects, and what he found is that they would peck 10 times as many times at the sphere than any of the other shapes. So he made the conclusion that the chicks preferred this object because it resembled food. And again, them being raised in darkness and then not necessarily having any ability to learn, and he found that they preferred, or, you know, again, measured that they pecked more times on the sphere, it concluded that there might be some innateness to their preference as well. The second study, because obviously babies are not much like chicks per se, they don't peck. He chose something more similar to a human infant, and that was a chimpanzee. He invented a methodology called a looking chamber, and what this did is it allowed people to look through a peephole and to look into the cornea of the chimpanzee and to see what was reflecting in the cornea. And he could then tell what it was that the chimpanzee was looking at. So he could tell the difference between how long a chimpanzee looked at a object, and what he hypothesized is that the one he looked at longer was something that he preferred. And that kind of makes sense. I mean, there's definitely some things that we look at longer because we're horrified by, but most of the time it's when we're looking at something, it's something that we prefer, something that we like. So the cool thing about this methodology is it was, kind of the first time that you were really able to allow babies to talk before they're able to communicate. And you'll see this methodology, this looking preference, used in a lot of the different studies that we talk about in this class where the babies are nonverbal. So basically, they said that this methodology allowed babies to be asked a question in a way that they understood it, as well as a way for them to answer it in the way that the researchers understood it. So this was kind of groundbreaking in child psychology in terms of doing studies. Okay, so the first study with infants, because obviously that was the goal, you can see that he was looking at babies that were from 1 week to 15 weeks old, so very, very young. He did that same kind of technique that he talked about, or that I just talked about with the chimpanzees. He would put the babies in a looking chamber, and the next, here I'm gonna real quick, I'll go right back so you can envision this while I'm talking about it. This is what the looking chamber looks like. So basically it's a little cot, the baby lays here. This researcher is looking down through a peephole. The baby cannot see the researcher, and she's looking at the corneas of the baby to see what it is that the baby's looking at. And then the baby's presented different stimuli like these ones over here. So let me go back to talk about the study. So there were 30 infants. They tested them weekly between the ages of 1 week, so newly born, and 15 weeks. And he showed them 4 pairs of test patterns. They were differing in complexity and pattern. So here are 3 different examples of what the patterns were. Horizontal lines in a bullseye, checkerboard, and 2 squares of different sizes, and a cross and a circle. So he would put them in that looking chamber you just saw. He'd present each stimuli, and he would measure the time that the infant spent looking at it and recorded it. And what the results were is that reliably, they would look longer at the more complex pattern. And so he concluded that they had preference for the complex patterns. And he actually found that they had preferences for, like, for example, the checkerboard over the plain square. So whatever was busier. So if you think about it, going to that picture again, yes, I do agree that it could indicate preference, and it also could indicate processing, because this might take more time to process for the infant. So the plus tells you what it was that they preferred of those pairs. But I can also see, this is more complex than the face, yet they preferred the face. And he did lots of studies with actual models of human faces, and he put them in the features in different places than they normally are, and they still preferred that over some of the patterns. So I can see not only processing, but like, this is more interesting to look at, the checkerboard. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but the checkerboard is more interesting to look at than a plain gray square. And a bullseye is more interesting to look at than a triangle. So that is what he concluded, is that they would spend more time looking at them, and that was what they preferred. So the second study, he did not give much information in terms of the age, and I don't know if it was just poorly written, but they said that it basically included infants that were 6 months old and babies that were less than 1 month old. So we had a range there. And he did the same kind of thing with the looking chamber, presented the different stimuli, measured and recorded the time looking, but this time he showed them a series of black and white striped patterns. So basically, I think the next one shows you, real quick, over there and back. They were of varying thickness. So he was looking for visual acuity in this one. And he was looking at how well they could see these. So what he found is that babies who were 6 months old could see the stripes that were 1/64 inches at a distance of 10 inches. And at 1 month old, they could see the 1/8 inch stripes at 10 inches. So you can see here we're looking more at acuity as well as ability to see. So remember when we talked in the very beginning of this PowerPoint about the way that they saw from birth to 1 year, that's kind of what he's looking at here, like how well they see as opposed to what they prefer to see. And as I showed you in this one, it just kind of gives you an idea of the examples that he showed. So this would be more like the 1/8, and this would be more like the 1/64. So he found that the babies, as they aged, were able to detect more difference between them. Okay, the third study, he looked at babies anywhere from 4 days of age to 6 months of age. Now here's where we pull like the most, I would say, influential information from when we look at what preferences are. He showed them 3 flat objects that were about the size and shape of a head. The first one had a face-like pattern. The second one had facial features that were scrambled. And then the third one was the same amount of like darkness on it, but it was all arranged at the top of the disc. And I will show you these images in just a second. Same methodology, place them in the looking chamber, presenting all of the possible pairings with each stimuli, and again, measured the looking time and recorded it. And what he found was that babies of all ages look longer at the facial than the not facial. And they preferred the non-facial arrangement over the single black pattern. So what do these look like? Here we go. Okay, so as you can see, you have the actual face, the mixed up face, and then the same amount of darkness that is represented in the face and the mixed up face all in one area. And what they preferred is the actual face over all the others. And he would pair them with, you know, the face and the black area, the face and the mixed up face. And he found repeatedly that they preferred the face. So here is just another little diagram that I stole from online that has kind of color integrated into it too. So and this is what you see in research. If they've already got everything set up, they keep on trying different things. So they tried the facial, they tried newsprint, they tried patterns, they tried colors. And this graph shows you the percent of time that they spent looking at. And overall, you know, it's always was the face. So here were some people trying to replicate Vance's study, and they actually used human models as opposed to more of the cartoon ones that he used. And same results kind of came about. Is you can see the amount they looked at the normal face more than the upside down face. This one that probably is as similar to the normal face, where it's top heavy, where it's kind of the things are in the right area but in the wrong position. And then because of the fact that they preferred that configuration, they tested it against the regular face, and you can still see that they preferred the upright face, but there was still a lot of preference for, you know, that normal facial setup. And then we've got the last study. The last study looked at, here's where that one with the newsprint came in. The last one looked at, again, 6-inch wide flat discs that were different from each other. There were 3 that were patterned, 3 that were plain. The patterns include a face, a bullseye, and a patch of printed material, like a newspaper clipping, like you saw in that other slide. And then it had also colors. So they used red, fluorescent, and yellow, and white. So, you know, a lot of people think, I mean, as adults, that bright color attracts us, but their ability to see color is not fully developed. So for an infant, the red and the fluorescent yellow was not nearly as attractive to them as the busy patterns. And again, that was his results, that they basically looked longer at the patterns. And the one that they looked at the most was the face. So he did all of those different studies, and that is how we get the little blurb in the child development or the human growth and development textbook that says babies prefer to look at faces. Okay, so that is kind of the summary of these studies. Here's just another like visual so that you can kind of see patterns that he used. I think it's helpful to kind of see a visual of the rather abstract explanation that they have in the textbook. So they again did tons of different pairings. And so when we look at, what are the conclusions or what is the value of this study, he definitely gave us a different way that we can talk to babies and actually listen to what they have to say. He definitely challenged the idea that perception is learned, that pairing through reinforcement is how babies perceive preference. And then his methodology was definitely seen as something that changed the way that we study infants. So lots of great stuff came from his studies. So I am going to jump back to our class real quick. You guys have any questions about this unit or anything for that matter? See, there's that little looking machine.
So was he trying to argue that that this preference is learned or that it's one of the baby's reflexes? Like
he was trying to argue that it was innate. So he was trying to disprove the behaviorists who were saying that they felt that it was learned.
Okay.
That's a good question. Open this up real quick. Did the study guide come up? Or do I need to do a new share?
I don't see anything.
Okay. Do a new one. So this is the study guide. The quiz for this unit is pretty short, but you are going to want to know that whole idea of how behaviorists felt that perception was learned, which means what is the focus of behaviorism? They looked for objective, measurable behavior. And so they were looking for the pairing repeated and how that influenced behavior. Okay. I also want you guys to know the difference between sensation and perception. And I want you to understand like a very brief summary. I try to ask easy questions that assess your understanding of his studies. Okay. That they basically preferred faces and more complex patterns. If you know those two things, that should be sufficient in terms of answering the questions, if you can just remember those. You guys have any other questions?